All righty, thanks. Okay, we're going to get started. Today we'll include a mission moment. Some of you know we always start out with the mission moment, was a little bit about why we do what we do. Actually have a couple of them to share with you today. David will talk to you, share with you some volunteer recognition, and then we'll get started with our safety session with Alexi Stavropoulos, who's one of our safety officers. The first mission moment I wanted to show you today is this is our pilot, Rod McDermott, flight out of John Wayne and his co-pilot, Kevin Kim, with Maria Yu there. And I'm not going to read this whole thing for you, but you can see Maria's comment to us. She flies from Las Vegas to Southern California multiple times. She's actually quite sick and is really, really appreciative of the help. This slide is, you're looking at a picture there of Susan Vandenberg. Susan was a patient there in Colorado, flew from Durango over to Denver for treatment for her ovarian cancer. Sadly, Susan passed away on February 11th of this year. Susan had flown 105 missions with us over many, many years with 43 different pilots. What you're seeing there is just a brief comment, but I want to read you a note that she sent to us just a short while back. She says, thanks so much again, Sherry and Natalie, and of course all the staff and donors for getting me to and from my appointments and Aviation treatment in Denver this past week on United. Another amazingly generous gift on your part. This was a particularly rough week, being in the ER unexpectedly on Thursday, feeling pretty ill during the trip on Friday, and then learning that the results of some of my tests at UC Health were somewhat disheartening. Dr. Beckbach wants to pursue this line of treatment, though for a while longer, so I'm hoping for some more positive news in the weeks to come, with the goal being to keep me off more full-blown chemo for as many months as possible. This illness has been pretty challenging, and while it's sometimes hard to keep my spirits lifted, I try to remember all the efforts of folks like you who have my back. And it helps me to keep on moving forward with a positive attitude and with a heart full of gratitude to you, truly my angels. Many, many thanks, my friend Susan. Your generosity and the work that you do for this organization makes a huge impact on people's lives. Please know that, and please know how much we here at the office and all of the Angel Flight staff really appreciate what you do. I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thanks, Sherry. So this month we wanted to highlight our new volunteers. So pretty excited to have 25 new pilots and 2 new Earth Angels. So if you see these folks around, welcome them all to the family. The photo here is Nolan Solano. He's already flown a few missions this year. So give you a moment to look through all our new names.
Okay, I'm going to take this time to introduce Alexi Stavropoulos. Alexi will tell you just a little bit about himself. Some of you have already heard him speak. Alexi is one of our co-safety officers with Bruce Polton, who the two of them share this job. So Alexi, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm off mute, so I think I'm good. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for the great introductions and the heart-warming story there, Sherry. That's a great reminder of what we all do, what we do. And my personal thanks to all for the volunteer work and all the great work that you do. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about an article that was written a couple of months ago regarding ground operations. So we're not actually going to get airborne. We're going to just talk a little bit about decision-making processes on the ground, 3 specific subjects that we'll get into. I want to start with a little disclaimer. This is not a flying lesson. I'm not trying to tell you how to operate your aircraft. There is an abundance of experience out there from all of you, different levels. We have some highly experienced professional pilots to newly minted private pilots. So these are just some nuggets I'm hoping to throw out there to help you with your planning and decision making. Again, I'm open to suggestions, criticism at the end. Email me, call me anytime. This is all about safety. It's not about me telling you how to conduct yourselves and how to do things. So I thank you for allowing me to participate in this and offer my 2 cents from my experience. I've done a lot of safety work for United Airlines as a professional pilot there. Been the safety chair for the company, for our association, for the union for over 20 years. And I've had the privilege of conducting hundreds of flight safety investigations for our incidents that we've had. And when we have 2 to 3,000 departures a day, no one is immune from having incidents. And then one thing that I learned is that no one is immune from it. This, no matter what your experience level is, no matter what your preparation is, things happen. So this is a highly complex environment we operate in. So I wanted to, add my experience and what I've learned through all these years of doing safety work. So again, we'll talk about the pre-departure briefings and passenger briefings. But first, I want to start with what I like to always use and incorporate in all these discussions, and it's the threat and error management model. Jess, if you could put the first slide. Thank you. And please understand that this might seem like a very structured process that maybe we don't think we use in general aviation. I do fly a single engine piston on the side for range of flight and personal reasons, so I understand that methodology as well. But I'm willing to bet that all of us at some point have utilized this process, whether we know it or not. So just a brief summary. I know I've talked about it before. Looking at this upside down pyramid, if you will, our top portion there talks about safe operations, which is where we want to live. We want to live in an environment of safe operations. What's underneath is threats, sometimes referred to as concerns or outside factors and some inside factors. The FAA has used several acronyms that I know you're all familiar with, such as I'm safe and other procedures that we use to mitigate those threats. But in my day job, we talk about personal threats, environmental threats, and technical threats. Personal being what's going on with us. Environmental has to do with the airport environment, weather, what have you. Technical could be something mechanical with the airplane that's limiting its capabilities, or something with the airport, nav aids, what have you. So as you can see, we have the threats. We need to prepare for those threats as best as we can. Some of the threats are known beforehand and some are not. The ones that are not may cause some startle, but the ones that are known, it's best to prepare for them in order to return back into safe operations. And you can see on the right side there, it says CRM 10. Don't let that throw you off. CRM is crew resource management. And I understand in our general aviation world, we typically work with single pilot operations. So we can apply the same principles. We can talk about single resource management, if you will, the SRM. The threat and error management is the skills are kind of listed underneath. And they're pretty common sense, if you will, planning and decision making, leadership effectiveness. Let me give you an example of leadership. We always heard the term that we can say enable to air traffic control, right? And they might tell us, hey, maintain 180 knots till 5 miles. Well, can't quite do that in a Cessna 182. So let's give him another option. Well, that's a leadership. Us voicing the fact that we're not able to do this and taking charge of our pilot and command duties is an example of leadership. Situational awareness goes without saying. Communication, how we talk to each other, how we talk outside, how we talk to our passengers. And obviously monitor, cross-check our instruments, our electronic flight bag. We know the influences from outside to inside and so forth. And lastly, workload and automation management, how we manage those in order to mitigate those threats. So these are the threats. We prepare for them, back to safe operations. If we don't really prepare for a threat, it might lead into an error. And I've yet to fly the perfect flight. I say that all the time. I make errors on every single flight. So I suspect most of us would admit the same. And then the goal is, if we are become aware of that error, is to repair that with our TM skills, CRM or SRM skills, in order to go back into safe operation. And lastly, if we don't repair those errors, we might very well end up in a UAS, which is an undesired aircraft state. And again, like I've mentioned in the past, a UAS does not mean we're upside down, headed for the ground. It could be as simple as we didn't turn the pitot heat on while we're about to enter a cloud in low temperature situations. That's an undesired aircraft state. We recover from that, we turn it back on, we through CRM temp skills, and we go back into safe operations. Obviously, if we don't recover from a UAS, we may have an incident or accident. So that is basically um, the summary and the umbrella under which I think we all operate under, and the foundation that we all operate under when we conduct our flights. So that's good there, Jess. We can take that out. Thank you. So the first subject we're going to talk about is pre-departure briefings and passenger briefings. And I want to be a little bit more specific to that because we have briefings that we conduct for how we will interact with our angel flight passengers in the sterile flight deck, sterile cockpit procedures, and so forth. I want to focus a little more in evacuations, and I will start with this sentence and I'll finish it at the end as well. Our goal is to provide and arm our passengers with a solid, self-initiated briefing so that they can initiate their own evacuation if they needed to. And it's a touchy subject on how to broach that. I understand that because sometimes we have first-time flyers, and it's a very delicate matter, right? We want to be careful to not scare them in thinking, oh, this is going to happen, right? They're already nervous enough when the fact that they're flying a general aviation aircraft. But we need to be very deliberate and very articulate with the mechanical steps of exactly how they could initiate an evacuation on their own. I had the privilege decades ago when I was a student at Embry-Riddle. I went down to Phoenix Sky Harbor. The school was in Prescott, and I was conducting a survey for I had an emphasis in aviation safety accident investigation, and one of my classes I was writing a paper, so I was trying to do a survey. So I'm sitting there in baggage claim with a clipboard, trying to convince everybody I'm not trying to sell them Bibles or anything like that. So when I finally got them to talk to me, I was able to ask a few questions about whether or not they were really attentive with the passenger briefing, the evacuation briefing that the flight attendants will conduct. And you've all heard the story, right? And we're sitting there in a commercial airliner, and the flight attendants say, "Please give us your undivided attention." Does anybody do that? No. Everybody's looking on their phone, or they're back in the day in the newspaper or what have you, and they're not really paying attention. So when I asked these passengers I asked them 5 questions, and most of which had to do with whether or not they felt comfortable or familiar. And I sensed a really good comfort from all of them until I asked the last question. And the last question was, in the event of a required evacuation when the cabin is full of smoke, you can't see in front of your nose. There's a tremendous amount of heat. You can see fire. It's chaos. You might be even upside down. Are you going to be able to, by feel, make your way to the exit and then by feel, open that door? And that gave everybody pause. So I'm not saying that that's what's going to be happening in our airplanes, but it is something to consider. And I'll briefly talk about one of the worst aviation accidents, which I know I've mentioned before, which is the ground collision. Effectively, was a ground collision at Tenerife in 1977. Two 747s collided on the ground, foggy conditions on the runway. Tower could not see the aircraft. The Pan Am 747 was back taxiing on the runway. The KLM took off inadvertently without a clearance. There was some potential ambiguity with the phraseology that was used. That was a contributing factor. But at the end of the day, the aircraft departed without a clearance. By the time that the KLM aircraft saw the Pan Am aircraft saw the KLM coming at them, the KLM aircraft decided to do an early rotation. Unfortunately, that wasn't successful. The Pan Am aircraft tried to evacuate the runway basically on the dirt, but a collision ensued. The KLM aircraft was slightly airborne. Unfortunately, everybody perished on that airplane, but there were people that evacuated successfully from the Pan Am aircraft. And one of the interesting things was because the flight attendants were mostly standing and therefore incapacitated, and the folks that did evacuate did self-initiate their evacuation. And the common ingredient among all those that were successful in their evacuation was that they were prepared. They had considered the fact that they would evacuate, and they prepped for it. The ones that just sat there, according to the witness reports from the folks they evacuated, they were motionless. Again, it was a startle effect, right? We talked about startle in our last report. It gives you fight or flight. And the flight in that particular situation would be inaction, right? The negative panic, the fact that the lack of preparation led into inaction, which was not a successful outcome there. So again, going back to our situations and our passengers, is make sure that you are very deliberate with the door, the exit, how the seat's going to go forward when they're sitting in the back, how they're going to give them those steps so you can empower them with the ability to evacuate. And for the record, we have had an incident at Angel Flight West where the pilot was incapacitated and the passengers had to self-evacuate. So it's not an unknown subject for us. So that's for the briefing. Let's move forward a little bit now, and we started to taxi. So again, as I promised, we won't get airborne today. So we are starting to taxi, and we have threats again, depending on where we are. Let's say that we are at a very complex airport with very complicated taxi procedures. By the way, I'm talking fast because I'm trying to get to questions later. I'm hoping I wrap this up in 15 to 20 minutes so I can be open to your questions and respect your time. So we live in a world where we are fortunate to have electronic flight bags at our disposal, and we might not think of them that way, but that's what they are. That's what ForeFlight is. That's what Garmin Pilot is. And I think most of us, when we operate an airplane, have access or utilize something like that. In the professional world, it's a requirement that we have the airport diagram open and available. Back in the day when we had charts, today in an electronic format. And if we are able to have ownership position and be geo-referenced and actually see where we're at in that complex environment, even better. That really increases situational awareness. So I highly encourage you to do that everywhere you operate out of, even in your familiar airport, your home airport. It's a habit pattern, right? That's what we're trying to create. If we have that open and we look at where we're going all the time and we are aware, we can mitigate the threats for the environments that we're not so aware of. Also, these electronic flight bags have great equipment where we can actually draw on them. So we can draw with, let's say, green, our clear taxi route, and with red, maybe some NOTAMs where we have taxiways that are closed or something where there's construction. Um, so we want to brief that. We want to discuss what our taxi plan is going to be, especially in airports that we're unfamiliar, prior to us being into that environment. So we have an idea of what we will receive, what is our expected taxi out plan, which, by the way, also we need to include our taxi in plan. So when we brief our arrival, let's talk about how we're going to get to our destination at the airport from the runway. What is that going to look like? And what threats do we have? Do we have runways, other runways that we need to cross while we're waiting? And these are items that need to be highlighted so that we can address them as they come. Let's talk about hotspots and any NOTAMs. So it's important to highlight hotspots. Let's not just give them lip service, right? There are these little brown circles that exist in different parts of the airport sometimes, especially in control tower airports. And the reason that they're there is because their existence is due to the fact that there's a very high level of incursions, either runway incursions or taxiway incursions at those specific spots. So if we have them, let's tap on them, open them up, expand them, and see why they're there. And let's definitely brief them and add them as an environmental threat that we need to, if you recall, prepare for so we can remain in safe operations. And here's another question. Are we going towards a taxiway, excuse me, a runway that we're cleared for? And I saw that happening at SFO, by the way. For those of you that are West Coast that used to fly out of San Francisco over the last couple of years, especially last summer, where one runway was closed due to construction. I saw that being violated day after day by everybody, every airline, and even the ATC was looking the other way. If you're cleared to a runway, and your taxiway path is going to cross another runway, even if that runway is loaded with bulldozers and personnel and equipment working on there and cones, and it just looks like it's a construction site, which is exactly how runway 28 left used to look when we were going there. One cannot cross that runway without a clearance. And I saw that happening over and over and over. And ATC would look the other way. But still, just remember to add that into your threat briefing. If you're crossing a runway, you need to have a clearance so that there's no ambiguity about that. Be aware of runway status lights. That's a relatively new thing. We don't have them, obviously, in non-towered airports for the most part, but in towered airports we have. And I've been subject to that, where I was given a clearance to cross, yet the red bars were illuminated, and they needed to turn those off. It's a violation if you turn them off. And some of those places will self-initiate a violation. It's automatic, and just because you cross that light, it's got sensors that sense when the airplane crosses those red bars. So be aware that there's multiple things that need to happen in order for you to proceed. Um, so the last couple of things is also we need to be aware of expectation bias. We're used to a certain route to a runway or from a runway to an FBO, let's say, and we expect that we will receive that. And especially if we're a little fatigued or maybe distracted, we end up going that route. That's happened many times to professional crews, down to private pilots or student pilots. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't discriminate that error. So be aware of that. So if you hear something that's a little different, query it. And I will tell you, having attended many runway safety meetings, especially at SFO with the National Air Traffic Controllers Association and ALPA as well, whenever there's construction at an airport, the likelihood of a runway or taxiway incursion just increases exponentially. So add that to your threat briefing. If you see construction, that should give you pause to really reevaluate again what your taxi process is going to be. And finally, on this subject, normalization of deviance. We've talked about that before. What is it that we do when we taxi that potentially distracts us from the task of taxiing? Are we doing other things? Are we doing checklists? Are we programming our navigation system? Are we, talking to passengers when or are we talking about something that's not related to our flight? And are we multitasking? We've talked about that before. We don't multitask. We just divide our attention, right? We go from taxiing to doing this other item, back to taxiing to do this other item. So our taxi might actually be fine. We might be well, but guess what? Maybe we didn't complete that said checklist very well, or we didn't program our navigation system very well because we're busy taxiing. So it's not necessarily that our taxiing will suffer. Something may very well might suffer. Now, in multi-crew situations, yes, we do conduct checklists, but if you're a single pilot, I would urge you to wait. And the 30 seconds that you would save by doing it while taxiing, wait till you do it in the run-up area, even if it means another aircraft gets ahead of you. Those are the habit patterns you need to create, because we all need to create, because the problem is there's no feedback for those good habit patterns. We don't know what we potentially prevented by doing the right thing. That's where the leadership effectiveness comes in. That's the threat neuromanagement model of leadership, where we will do this and we won't know that we just maybe saved ourselves from a serious event. That's the challenge of that kind of preventative safety, if you will. So that's it for runway and taxiway incursions. Now let's get to the runway and let's talk about rejected takeoffs. And this is a near and dear subject to me because that was probably one of the number one reasons for flight safety investigations were, especially high speed rejects. And I'm not going to get into the details of professional flying where we have, V1 decision speeds and balanced and unbalanced field and so forth, because that's not really in our world in general aviation. That might be the case for those of you that are flying high performance aircraft, jet aircraft, et cetera. That's obviously something you deal with during recurrent training and your normal training. And you also have performance tables to highlight that. But in our world of GA, of single piston or multi-piston, we really don't have a lot of data on that, right? We kind of go and we don't really talk about it in my experience, but I absolutely think we should. And that is, again, something that we need to pre-brief. That is a very high threat environment, and we need to pre-brief that. And what I'm trying to say is the decision of what we will reject for cannot occur at the time of the reject. It needs to happen well before in advance. So during the time where we are faced with a startle of an event that would cause us to maybe reject or continue, that decision is already made. We just react. And I'll give you some examples. In my world, and I brief this when I fly, my single engine airplane. I have a list of items that I refer to as unsafe, unable to fly. Those items I will not go airborne with. right? So no matter what the runway length is, I will reject for those items. If it's an engine failure, an engine fire, or any kind of fire for that matter, a flight control, or if we had hydraulics, I don't, but if we had hydraulics, if there's a failure in flight control or a wind shear, or if tower says something, or even if there's runway status lights, those items I will reject for, regardless of where I am, what kind of runway length I'm dealing with. But there are other items that I may not reject for, or I may reject for, depending on the runway length. So let me give you an example. Jess, if you want to put the first chart. Great. Okay. I'll get into that here in a second. So I operate out of Petaluma Airport, which is in Northern California in Sonoma County, and the runway is 3,600 feet long, right? So I know I don't have a way of really determining what my accelerate stop distance. So there's no graph for it. So my technique is I kind of create my own. I look at my takeoff distance. Let's say a max gross weight for me, 3,600 pounds. I'm at sea level, ground roll at 20 degrees Celsius. I've highlighted there. It's 1574. And that, let's say 1,600 feet. Okay, so now let's scroll up to the 50% landing. Thank you. Okay, so there's that one. And that is the ground roll for landing distance with 50% flaps, which is my takeoff flap setting. And 20 degrees C. So basically, as you can see at the fine print up there, it says we're going to cross the threshold at 87 knots. And so that means the 50-foot obstacle at 87 knots, which is about the threshold. And then, we're going to touch down with something less than that. So which will probably match our rotation speed, if you will, right? Whatever speed our takeoff distance had, this is probably when we're going to touch down. And we don't need to show the next graph, Jess, but the next one is on 100% flap. So obviously it's going to be a little slightly lower distance, but you get the gist of it. So I had a takeoff roll of about 1,600 feet, and I have a ground roll of, let's say, about 1,300 feet. So I had those two together. I know it's rudimentary, and all of you engineers out there, don't bark at me, but that is the best I can come up with and again, I'm not talking about getting airborne at all and rejecting the takeoff. I'm talking about right of rotation, I make a decision to reject. So my total roll from accelerate to rotation to stop, it's going to be, in my mind, the addition of those two distances. So right about 2,900 feet or so. So when I'm in Petaluma and the runway length is 3,600 feet, I can brief that I will reject for anything prior to rotation, any kind of annunciation, my door pops open, anything, I will be like, because I know I have ample runway to leisurely stop and exit at the end of the runway, assuming it's nothing major. Or I can, if I need to evacuate that because something more major, then I'll do that. But let's talk about being in, let's say, and Jess, you can take those off if you like that. Thank you. Let's say now I'm at San Carlos Airport, which a lot of Angel flights operate out of. That runway length is 2,600 feet. I think you know where I'm going with this. So, assuming if I haven't briefed and I'm at my rotation speed in San Carlos and I get a ding of a crew advisory system on my airplane and it says Alt 1, and it's going to startle me, right? I'm definitely going to be startled. Or my door pops open. Where now I'm feeling all this wind and noise, again, a startle effect. If at that point I think to myself, yeah, I'm here, I need to reject because I haven't done the briefing. Well, based on my calculations, I won't stop before the end of the runway. I'll overrun if I'm at max gross weight and likely end up over the fence and potentially have a serious incident. If I've briefed it beforehand that, hey, I am going to only stop for what's unsafe, unable to fly, and that does not include the door open. That does not include an Alt 1 failure. I can take that airborne and deal with the problem and come back and land. Again, if I'm in Petaluma, plenty of runway, yeah, I briefed it that I will reject for anything. If I am in San Carlos, that is not a reason I will reject for. Again, if I have a fire, I don't want to take that airborne. I'm willing to take the risk of potential overrun. So these are some of the things I'd like you to consider. They're mandatory in the professional world that we brief all these items of what we will reject for and what the high-speed regime is. And that's up to you to determine what When you are in a high-speed regime, you can do it in a geographical way. You can say, I've passed this taxiway in my roll, so I know I am more than halfway down the runway and I should be at said speed, whatever the case is for your airplane. But I'd like you to add that decision-making process to your briefing. To me, that is highly, highly critical. And by the way, I did just recently debrief an Angel Flight pilot that had a reject, and we had this lengthy conversation about that. So it does happen to us, and it was out of a very runway restricted environment. So as you can see, this discussion is not just airport specific, it's runway specific. That's another trap. There are airports that have multiple runways. And sometimes because we are a small airplane, they'll put us in the short runway. So that nice little briefing I had at the FBO going, yeah, I'm taking off the 10,000-foot runway. Well, that might need to change. So now you'll need to reassess that and reevaluate it. Again, don't wait for the startle factor to make your decision. It's you're really increasing the odds of a not, a successful outcome if we don't pre-brief that. Again, that's our threat neuromanagement that we brief. Um, so the last thing I will say about this is also brief the mechanical steps of the reject. It depends on your airplane, right? You would think, well, how much more complicated than that is to bring throttles to idle and stop straight ahead. Well, it could be more complicated than that, right? Depending on your airplane and what kind of equipment you have on it. But um, still, one other thing I add to those mechanical steps is what is the reason I'm rejecting? Am I rejecting because my engine is rough? Okay, well then I'll bring the throttle idle, stop straight ahead, and try to exit the runway. Or do I have a fire somewhere in the cabin in my engine, and do I need to evacuate? What are going to be my steps? Remember, we don't rise to the occasion, right? We regress to the last thing we briefed or drilled. So if I drill that and brief it, then my brain is mechanically going to go there doing the startle. That's going to be my response. So I'm going to say, I do brief if I, in case of a fire or any reason I need to evacuate, throttle idle, stop straight ahead, mixture cut off, fuel pump off, fuel selector off, ignition off, switches off, evac. Where's the fire extinguisher? Right? So because I'm going to leave the airplane on the ground and just run and or declare an emergency if I have to. So plan on briefing those. And by the way, I'll get us airborne for a second. Same thing we need to do for the go around. There'll be another discussion, but if we have a go around, let's make sure that we brief the mechanical steps of a go around so that when it happens, most likely following the startle event, tower tells us to go around or something causes us to go around. We have those mechanical steps and we respond to them very mechanically, if you will. So again, in brief summary, we talked about the threat neuromanagement model in that kind of upside down pyramid and the things that we do to mitigate threats, to avoid errors, repair errors, and recover from undesired aircraft states. We talked about the passenger briefings and how we want to arm our passengers with a self-initiated evacuation capability. We talked about the threats during complex taxi, and even when they're not complex, some of the tools we can use to expectation bias, normalization of deviance, and kind of minimizing distractions, using electronic flight bags to our betterment and how to mitigate those threats. And lastly, we talked about rejected takeoffs, specifically briefing different procedures and processes depending on the runway environment and how we can conduct those and how we can need to brief the mechanical steps, etc. So that is really all I have. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go too far, too long, but I know I spoke like an auctioneer. I apologize for that. But I'm open to questions, suggestions. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can't think of them right now, please shoot me an email or call me. My phone is off when I'm sleeping, so you'll never bother me. Call me anytime, wherever I'm on the planet. I love getting into the weeds and talking about all these cool subjects. So I'm open to any questions.
And he is all over the planet, I will tell you guys that. So, a couple things. Again, if you have a question, raise your hand, just speak up, drop it in the chat. David will drop in the email address in the chat for Alexi and Bruce. It's a combined one, so it'll get to both of them. Let's see. Did we have any questions? I know it usually takes just one question to unplug the little dam.
I understand that.
Okay, and anybody? Well, Alexi, thank you. I think no questions means that you were very clear about everything that you
All
were
right,
speaking about.
great.
The-
Well, everybody's very shy.
Someone has
it's
their
just,
hand raised, Sherry.
Ah,
uh, oh, Jonathan, Johan, I'm sorry, Johan. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Um, so I was wondering if you have resources you could point us to for coming up with a departure briefing, something that can guide us through the things we have to look at step by step, because I have to practice this on the ground before I taxi up to the runway, because when I get there, I'm not going to know what to brief. So do you have some resources we could find to do an effective brief?
that's a great question. And yes, I know that most like even sporty pilots and places like that, pilot supplies stores, they actually have briefing cards. I'm pretty sure that Cirrus makes one as well. I think I have one. So what I'll do, I'll make it my task to find those because I'm off the top of my head. I don't necessarily have one that jumps out. But you're absolutely right, Johan. You do need to practice those. Uh, Trust yourself in what those are. They're not very different than what we hear in commercial airliners. Honestly, it's exit plan, how to operate the doors. I take it a little step extra, and I even say things like, if you actually need to kick the windshield out, get on your back, use your feet, kick it out. And in my airplane, I have a little hammer too that I tap on the sides and the corners of the wind of the whatever glass they're trying to get out of, so that will shatter it and they can exit. But that's a great task for me, and I will take it and I will come up with something, and we'll put out a mass email to answer that question so that I can provide you with some guidance on that. It is indeed it's lacking in our industry because in our general aviation world, because it's assumed that it's easy and self-explanatory, right? We don't have evacuation processes for getting out of a car, but we so it's not necessarily very different. But I will come up with something and I'll get back to you. I think Johan, I have your personal info too. I think you and I talked a couple of weeks
Yeah,
ago.
we did.
Yeah,
So
right. So
thank you very much.
I'll send you something as well too.
Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Lee Gerstein from the Utah wing. A number of years ago, I flew a patient this is about evacuations, um, was coming to Salt Lake for ophthalmologic treatment. And it turned out that, for all intents and purposes, she was blind. She could see shadows, but she needed guidance, and she was flying solo. Pardon me. So I did the flight, and then in the comment section, I said, I think that this is a very difficult situation because if one ever had to evacuate, there is no way this woman could get out of the plane. She'd be feeling around. Um, I'm going to preserve patient anonymity, but this patient has been a long time Angel Flight uh, patient. And I don't know if her vision has improved or not, but it seems like a difficult issue. And like we are voluntarily ignoring something that is a red flag in order to service a patient who really needs our services. I don't know what you can say about it, but I'd be interested to hear what
Yeah.
you have to say.
You brought up an excellent subject, which brings up the unique mission, if you will, that we conduct. And I'll throw a little plug for my friend Mark Hansen, who just completed a webinar, an FAA fast read with just recently, a couple of weeks ago. And I think he's doing another one again. And I'm going to have him. I want him to be one of our speakers for the next safety forum or one of the future safety forums because he's flown over 500 missions and he has seen it all. And you could be either visually impaired, you could be someone who can't hear, and so that highlights the need to customize the evacuation briefing for each passenger. I am willing to say that I actually, if that passenger was willing, I would even say in a very loving and affectionate way, actually help them touch and feel every item, like the door, have them recognize what the distance is. Where I would actually say, if you're comfortable, I'm going to take your hand, move it from where you are, have you touch the door. This is the handle. This is how you would exit. I think we will be surprised how empowered someone would feel even with such a disability But for example, we do them in commercial aviation, right? We have specific briefings. The flight attendants will come and give us an individual briefing to a visually impaired passenger and someone also who is not able to hear very well or at all, to highlight, the commands and so forth. So I think you bring an excellent example of how aware we need to be. We also have passengers that maybe can't use their arms, that because of an injury or what's going on. So, these are some of the things we need to be aware of. And is there an element of risk, if you will, in the event of our incapacitation or how they would evacuate? Of course. And, it's up to our individual pilots to see, how able are they, to conduct this flight. Don't forget, you are pilot in command. No one's going to argue with you for your view of whether or not this passenger should be operating. They need to be ambulatory. That is a fact. But someone who is visually impaired, it's a great subject. So I would say, it's interesting. Years ago, I had probably one of the best experiences I had as a pilot. It was years ago. I was a 737 captain, and I had this young lady come up, and she said, "I have my dad here with me, who's blind. Been blind his whole life, and always wanted to feel and see a flight deck." So at first I paused, and everyone asked how deplaned. Flight attendants asked me if I can stay on. I'm like, yeah, gladly. So long story short, we brought this man in the flight deck, and I just spent so much time taking his hand and have him touch everything. This is the hydraulic pump, the A system. This is the flap handle. This is the gear. And he just lit up. And it made me remember and realize that, yeah, they are very empowered and capable of taking care of themselves. I had a very dear friend who was blind. She's passed away, but she would cook like there's no one else. I mean, the things that they can do just blew my mind, astonished me. So thank you for bringing that subject up. That is highlights the uniqueness of our flying. So I would just say, assess the situation, and if you feel it's someone that's willing to accommodate a briefing like that, go for it. Just be. I know everyone here is very empathetic, so I know you will do it in a professional and empathetic way. But yeah, have them feel everything. You will be surprised to the response.
That's a really useful answer. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the
And,
subject.
and Lee, I do believe she would be receptive to that as well.
Okay, thanks.
Hmm.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Sure. Alexi, thank you for a very good briefing. One question, in my aircraft for many years, at the recommendation of another friend who flew for American, I always carried a fire and smoke mask. I actually carried two, one for my wife. He had also suggested a little crash axe. What are your thoughts on adding that to private aircraft?
I think it's a great idea. I carry one because my greatest fear is an in-flight fire, cabin in-flight fire. To me, it's one of the most devastating emergencies we can have. And commercial airlines have had them with, unfortunately, devastating results. And we do have equipment on board to deal with that. So yes, I know pilot supply shops do sell those. I think it's a great idea. If nothing else, just one for the pilot, because ultimately it's you that needs to get the airplane down quickly and in order to then be able to initiate an evacuation. I am not so sure that it would be something that could be practical for everybody that's on board. I mean, you can have them. They're pretty compact and you can have them. But I would say for you as an individual, absolutely, I'm all for it. I carry one for that reason.
Okay.
Thank you. Anybody else? Well, thank you, Alexi. As always, it was fascinating, and I'm sure people learned a lot. David has dropped in the email address that will reach Alexi. Johan, he will get back to you with your information. And Jess, do we have our March date yet?
Not yet, but we will send
Okay. We'll send it out as soon as we get our March date for the town hall. We appreciate everybody's participation. Alexi and David, if you can. Lee, are you raising your hand?
Yeah,
Or waving
yeah.
goodbye?
Quick question: Is this video going to be available for us to distribute to local wings?
We'll put it on our YouTube safety channel. So Leah can make sure you know where that is directly, but it will be on
Great.
the YouTube account.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.